Welcome to Master the Game. I am Juce, and today we are talking about world building in this DM roundtable. Tonight's topic is factions and how important are they in your world. Let's go around the table, let everyone introduce themselves, and we are going to start with Fred today.
Hi, I'm Fred Wheeler. I run the How to D&D YouTube channel and talk mostly about Dungeons & Dragons to D&D5e, some RPGs from time to time. And you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Discord if you actually want to talk to me.
Excellent. Let's kick it on over to Josiah.
That's me. I'm Josiah. I go by Dungeon Dad on the internet. You can find me pretty much everywhere under Dungeon Dad, most primarily on YouTube, where I do Dungeons and Dragons content, which is focused mostly around monsters and encounter building.
Excellent. And next up, Sara.
Hey everyone, I'm Sara. I'm the TheHypeGoblin. You can find me under that name doing a whole host of things on the internet, including fantasy cosplays centered around Dungeons and Dragons and other TTRPGs, as well as some actual play content and some D&D roundtables like this one.
And I am Juce from Master the Game. You can find all of my stuff at masterthegamerpg.com. And we talk about a variety of tabletop gaming topics here on this channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Today's topic is factions and how important are they in your worlds. With that, Fred, what do you have to say about fractions? Factions in your worlds.
I want to hear what Fred has to say about fractions too.
I don't like fractions. Does anybody like fractions?
My earliest memory of fractions was in second grade, coming home from school and having to do homework and refusing and sitting at the table for 2.5 hours until I did it. So I hate fractions as well.
I think that's when I started hating math, honestly. I think that's, fractions.
The only time I like fractions is if there's a pie involved, like an actual pie you get to eat. That's the only time that a pie and fractions work for me. Pie, fractions, fine. Anything else? Okay, so factions rather than fractions. I don't really find them very important in my games. Okay. I know that seems very strange for some people because I know a lot of people like to have a lot of factions. They like to use factions. But it doesn't tie up a lot of my time in a game. There's really only 2 factions that I include and incorporate into the adventures that I run at my end, and that is the villain faction. So the villain has a series of individuals attached to them, and then there's the quest giver or patron and the faction they are associated with. And those 2 factions usually are at loggerheads in some way. I may from time to time put in a 3rd faction to throw a spanner in the works, but it's very rare. Ultimately, I find that the interest in factions in my games is generated by my players. So my players will attach themselves to a faction they've either created or that exists in a pre-made campaign setting. If it's not my own, they might make their own, they might use one that already exists and decide, okay, I want that to have some importance in this game. And so it's up to them to drive the faction concept rather than me. I don't really want to get involved in that. I'll kind of find that if you include factions, unless it's easier to have a conflict between 2 factions, which is why I go villain, patron, villain, quest giver. Bam. As soon as you have multiple factions going on, it gets very political, and seriously, I don't really want politics in my Dungeons and Dragons. I got enough of that here in the real world. Why the heck would I put that into my game? I know that Matthew Colville's right into that, but I don't care. I mean, I really don't care. So the only time factions are super important to me is if my players think that the factions are important, and if they are attached to a particular faction. I have joined the Harpers, or I have joined the Knights of LaRue, which is LaRue's the Knights of Unicorn Princess or Unicorn Goddess or whatever it is. I think that was a faction that we associated ourselves in one of the campaigns that was run not that long ago. So I always find that if the players are invested in a faction, whether they create it or they already are using it, then I'm happy to go with that. Otherwise, no, it's not going to happen. It's just the way I run games.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. All right, Josiah?
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment that you put forth about player-driven factions. That's definitely, if a player wants to be part of a faction, that's always going to be like one of the most important factions in a given campaign.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, part of what they want to do is be separate from that. That's obviously all this stuff is super like situational and is going to vary from game to game. But in general, yeah, I think player driven factions are like of the utmost importance. I do tend to use factions. I tend to use a lot of factions actually in my games for the political elements, but because I enjoy that to a degree. But what I don't typically do is try to force that on the players. What I'll do often is present like in kind of one-off bits of dialogue as part of someone role-playing with an NPC or just like something that they've heard about or whatever. I'll mention various factions, which kind of alludes to this idea that like, yeah, there's stuff going on. And if the players don't care and they're just like, all right, that's neat. Now let's go do this thing. Then that's all it needs to be. But if the players are like, we should investigate that. That sounds interesting. Basically, I like allowing them to kind of follow what leads they will, and then I will often develop out those factions further as the player pursues those thread lines. Like it's basically like a town where the front face of all the buildings are there, but there's nothing behind them. And then if the players decide they want to go knock on one of those doors, then suddenly we construct a building back there for them to go into.
Right.
Obviously there are exceptions to that, if you're running a game where like the central tension of your story is these 2 or 3 or 4 factions going head to head, but that's generally how I approach it. Something I do like to do a lot in order to make factions interesting, to kind of attract players to investigating them, is to take something from a faction and turn the status quo of what you'd expect of that faction on its head. For example, I've run games where we had kind of this group of like Knights Templar, and it's like, okay, you'd expect them like they're going to be like the enforcers, whatever, like they're part of whatever religion, they're mostly paladins and knights, etc., which was true of them, except I had it set up so that in this world, this one particular order of knights were heretics because they believed like a different version of like the religion that like the church they used to be a part of was a thing. So that immediately my players are like, well, why are they heretics? I was like, I don't know. Like you just overheard, like people are just talking about that. And someone referred to this guy as like the Grand Knight Heretic or whatever. And they're like, okay. So then they started asking around about that. And then I'm like, okay, well, they're heretics because they believe that God is dead or whatever. And they're like, well, why do they think that their God is dead? I don't know. So then they go and find members of that faction. And they're like, hey, why do you guys think that your God is dead? And I'm like, oh, have I got a story for you? Which kind of got them embroiled in this whole thing. And that was one of those things where I just mentioned that. And if the players were like, that's neat, those guys suck, and then they just moved on with their life, then cool, that's all it has to be. Yeah. But if they want to follow that plot thread and you kind of make it interesting by taking something and flipping it on its head, I think that can have a lot of value in it for sure. So that's typically my approach to factions, I suppose.
I like that. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I don't really other than like the good guy and the bad guy, I don't really use factions much unless there's interest in it. I have created them. The ones I have created are based on the mob. Okay. Because I deep dived the Gambino crime family at one point, and so I turned them into a criminal syndicate for a campaign. But unless there's like a lot of interest or a player specifically wants something, that's that's probably not where I'm going to put much of my attention. It'll be one of those things where, yeah, this thing is in the world, but unless you go and you start poking at it, I've got other stuff that I have to plan out.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, but once something is created in the world, like then it'll stick and then it'll be a thing. But other than like a player wanting to be from a criminal family or something.
Interesting.
Okay, what's that criminal family like? You know, you're a part of it. Just
right.
get it over.
Goes back to that player agency.
Yeah.
You tell me what it's like and about your character. I like that. So I am somebody who does a lot of factions in my homebrew world. Now, when I'm running like published modules, I don't dabble too much with factions unless it's in the module, for example. But when I'm running a homebrew thing, I like to have an idea, more of like the sandbox. I want to know from a DM standpoint what all is out there so that I can improv in the moment if my players do go off the rails or whatever. And in fact, I have a faction in my homebrew world that was actually originally a player group that we had done a session 0. We came up with this concept for the group. We never played a session. AJ Pickett was part of it. But we did a session 0 we never played. And it inspired this group called the Anvil Ringers. They were a faction that would seek out magic items and destroy them. They would keep whatever they wanted, but the ones they weren't going to use, they were going to destroy. Now, I, at some point, took that and ran with it and made my own rules for this faction and made it much bigger. And gave it, like, ranks. And it's like a secret society that people have heard of. And people, it's kind of like the Freemasons in our world, where people go, oh, we know something about it, but not everyone knows everything about it, and it's supposed to be secret, right? So in the Anvil Ringers, though, there's different ranks. Nobody at the lowest level knows anything about the upper levels. And then as you go up, you learn more. And I think there's 7 different like rankings. If somebody above you comes up and you have a magic item, so if you're a tier 1, for example, and they're tier 2, they can be like, hey, you have a really nice magical sword. I outrank you, give it over. And you have to. Also, you get your orders to go seek out certain items by people above you. You can do your own thing, but every once in a while you might get told from someone above you, hey, we need you to go do this. And then you have to go do this mission. So that's kind of what the Anvil Ringers are. Now, I have a spin-off group that is inspired a lot by the Templars in Dragon Age, like I was mentioning in a previous video, which you guys can go check out over here. But in that, it's this group called the Crusaders Against Magic. Now, they began as Anvil Ringers, but as they moved up and they saw how some people were corrupted and would use the magic items for personal gain, the Crusaders Against Magic spun off, started their own thing, and they're just against magic. The only exceptions are if it's detect magic, so they have clerics and stuff that can do that. Anything that helps them track down magic in any way, shape, or form, they will allow that. So it's divine magic. And then they're at war with the Anvil Ringers, and they just want to get rid of all magical items, magical beings, spell casting as a whole, because it's dangerous for society. And you can, as players, if players were interested in joining a faction, they could, or maybe it just comes up every once in a while in my homebrew games for like a side quest or things like that. But yeah, I love doing that. Now, for me, the thing that makes it interesting in factions is having a theme associated with them. The thing I've experienced in my games is when a faction has a very strong theme to it, the players, remember it more, and they take more interest in it, whether they oppose it or they're for it. And sometimes it's really fun if half the group likes it and half the group doesn't, and then it causes a little bit of inner conflict without necessarily being PvP. And that's always kind of fun as well. So yeah, that's my thought on factions. I think they're really cool. I don't think they're necessarily dire for a campaign, but when it comes to my homebrew world and stuff, I like having the sandbox and knowing what's everywhere so that when players do want to, again, investigate this thing, or maybe they take a liking to this NPC, maybe I layer on that NPC is part of this faction or whatever, and that motivates the way they are. Or maybe a certain city has a strong tie to a specific faction, and their leaders are part of that faction. And so then again, the missions or things that need to be done for this town can be themed around that as well. It just makes, I think, my job easier if I do that prep up front, and then throughout the campaign, it's just real simple. I can just run with it and improv very easily. So yeah. And
Yeah,
I loved what you had, Josiah, what you were saying about factions. And it's just like NPCs. When a player takes a strong interest in one, run with it. Let them have it. And it's kind of what you were saying too, Fred. Like, run with it and give the players what they want. If they don't have interest, then don't force it down their throats. And I don't. It can lead to politics, like in the in-game world politics, but it doesn't always have to. And like, again, that kind of depends on the level of involvement from the players, I think.
totally.
What were you going to say, Josiah?
Oh, I was just gonna say something I think that's really key when it comes to making factions is like it ties in with thematics, but is like I don't know how else to say it other than like marketing for that faction or like branding.
Yeah.
Because like I can't tell you how many times I've had a faction that was nothing aside from like a name and a logo. And
Right.
it's like and because it's interesting if you have a bunch of players and they're in town and they're like trying to investigate rumors of the area or whatever, and you have like, oh yeah, there was a knight in town 6 days ago and he cut down some dude in the street after they spoke and then walked away. You're like, okay, that's kind of interesting. But if you have that same thing, it's like, yeah, he was a knight, but he was a knight of the Black Rose. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Immediately you're like, the what? Like, what? That's a name. People know that. What does that mean? And no one's like willing to talk about it. Now it's a mystery. And even if that doesn't turn into anything, 10 sessions later, once you've done your work behind the screen, you're like, oh, I don't know what the fuck that means. Let me figure it out. What does that mean? What's this order all about? You drop in another reference to that. The players are like, oh, that's the thing. That's the guy. We heard about that. And then it's like, it becomes so much more real.
Yep.
I don't know. Yeah. So like, take a marketing class and use that to make D&D factions is my piece of terrible advice for you.
What you just said hits the nail on the head. Like, I love tying things together as a campaign goes on. So even if you didn't give them that this is the Black Rose up front, but maybe there was something at the scene. Maybe they were just like, well, what is left at the scene? I do an investigation check, or I'm looking at the stuff nearby. And you give them, like, maybe there's an item there. Like, oh, yeah, there's like a shovel off to the side. A shovel. Okay, whatever. And I'm just improvising right now. But then, like, 7 sessions later, there's, like, a group that is known for carrying their shovels. Because normally, if they have time, they bury the people they murder or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, they're like, oh, my gosh, this guy murdered that guy earlier. He just didn't have time to bury him.
Totally.
Like, I love that. Just tying stuff together later on. And like you said, it's the aha moment for those players. They're like, oh, we could have stopped this earlier on. Or, oh, now we've solved the original mystery that we didn't even know we were trying to solve. Or, you know.
I like letting the players unknowingly create the mystery.
Yes.
You just start theorizing and you just pick your most entertaining one as they're theorizing. You're just sitting there like with that all-knowing look, not really having anything written down. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that politician. Yeah, they totally murdered someone. Okay, let's see. How'd that happen?
It's incredible when you have that moment when a player's like, oh, you son of a bitch. And you're like, yes.
You thought it up.
I see that you're finally unraveling my insidious plan that has been the seeds have been planted for all this time, and they're just so riled up about something that you didn't know was happening. Like, yeah.
I just Wile E. Coyote it. I'll just there's the curtain.
Yeah.
Pull back. There's just a wall there, but I'm gonna let you think that it's actually a tunnel to somewhere.
In 2021, the creator of the Story Engine deck ran a successful Kickstarter called The Deck of Worlds. This is a Kickstarter that was for world building prompts. It has all sorts of different cards in it that are going to help you in your own world building. Now, the release date is going to be later this year, and pre-orders are now open. This is just a tool that I thought you guys would find useful based on the fact that you clicked on this video. This is not a paid advertisement.